All right, so the topic of today's lesson is learning targets. I hope to cover this in about 20 minutes. So feel free to pause this, take notes, and go back and watch areas over again. So the purpose of learning targets is really to help our students to know what it is that they are aiming for, to know that by the end of this lesson, what is it that I'm going to be able to do, and how am I going to demonstrate that? For us as teachers, it's really about clarity. It's about really knowing where it is that we want students to go so that when they're not getting there, we know how to help them. And it's also to help us to stay focused on our standards and to stay focused on what it is that we're supposed to be teaching. When we have a target, it's so much easier to stay focused and not get distracted. So today we're going to talk about selecting a standard for instructions, because that's always the start of a lesson. We're going to examine the taxonomy level of those standards. We're going to write I can statements, which are really the basis of how targets are written. And then we're going to learn how to use those targets with students, because after all, the target might be for us as we're planning, but it's more for students, so that students know what it is that they are supposed to do and they know what they're supposed to be learning. And when they know that, they're so much more likely to actually learn it. So the first thing we have to do is we have to select a standard. Dr. Bob Marzano once said that there are 14,000 hours of instruction contained within the current standards. But the fact of the matter is, we only have students for about 9,000 hours. What that means is that there is a whole bunch of the standards that we can't get to. What this also means is that we have to be really choosy. If we can't spend our time on everything, the things that we do spend our time on need to matter. We don't want to go an inch deep and a mile wide. If everything is important, then nothing ends up being important. What we have to do is we have to select. We have to select carefully. It might be really tempting to start off with your textbook and march through chapter by chapter. But the fact of the matter is that your textbook is not your curriculum. Your textbook is simply a resource. It's something that you can use with students to help them to learn the things that you want them to learn. And what is it you want them to learn? You want them to learn the standards. Now, we are really lucky in Nebraska that our state has standards in all core content areas: math, science, language arts, social studies, but also in career and technical education classes, in technology, in media sciences, in health, PE, fine arts, including visual arts and theater and music. Because we have state standards in all of these areas, most of you will have something that you can draw upon when doing your lessons and when teaching in the classroom. The only ones that don't have state standards are the Nebraska counselors, and they typically use the ASCA model. So when looking at a standard, we have to consider what's worth spending our time on. And there are 4 criteria. The first one is high leverage. Is this a standard that kids can use in multiple classes? I'll give you an example. A language arts standard that asks students to use evidence to support an answer is a high leverage standard. It's what I would call a suitcase standard. You can take it with you. You can take that standard or that skill with you from language arts into social studies class, into science class, into even PE or music or anywhere else. Constructing an argument and supporting it with evidence is a high leverage skill. That's something I want to spend some time on with my students. The second one is endurance. Is this something that students are going to need to know from year to year to year to year? In mathematics, an example of this might be, proportions, right? Proportions and ratio is a skill that shows up in multiple grade levels. And if we skip that in one grade level, then our students don't have that endurance. They're going to need that in the future. Readiness for the next level might kind of feel like the same thing, but that's really about thinking about it during this school year. So I need to add before I subtract. I need to multiply before I divide. I need to know my short vowels and decoding before I get into multisyllabic words, right? So readiness for the next thing. This is thinking about putting standards in order from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. And then my final concern is this included on my state test, the NSCAS? Is this included on a test for industry certification? Is it included in a test like the ACT? Is it included in something that my students need to pass for maybe my district unit assessment? So these are considerations when selecting a standard. I look at all the standards I have available for my subject area, for my grade, and I select the ones that are most critical for my students, and I invest my time there. For some of you, especially in larger districts, a lot of this work has been done for you. There are groups of people who come together and select the standards and organize them into a curriculum. For those of you in smaller districts, you kind of have to do this yourself. You really have to decide what's most important for your students. So, for the purposes of this assignment, you're going to select one standard. Just make it an important one, pick it, and don't worry about picking for a whole year. Just pick one standard for this lesson. So I'm going to give you some examples and non-examples of priority standards, of things that you would pick and then what you would not pick. So first of all, these are all Nebraska standards. The LA stands for language arts, math, social studies. The first number always tells you the grade level. The second number tells you the strand area. So number 1 in language arts is reading, number 2 is writing, and so forth. The number 4 tells you the standard. So this is the 4th thing in writing that students have to be able to do. And then the letter A is the indicator. So we typically work at the indicator level when we talk about standards in Nebraska. So if I had to think about a critical standard for my students, I'm going to pick apply context clues and text features to help infer the meaning of unknown words. And the reason I'm going to pick this standard is because it's a difficult standard that kids really have to work long and hard on to master. It's an assess standard on the NSCAS test at the end of the year. And it is a standard that they need for years to come. Context clues and text features hang around for a long time in the Nebraska standards. And I'm going to pick that as one of my critical standards. Whereas listening and reading text of increasing length is just something we're going to do naturally as part of language arts. It would be really hard to think of a 3rd grade class where they're not listening and reading text. So this does not become my priority standard. It comes in service of doing this. Guess what I'm doing when I'm looking for context clues? I'm reading. And where am I finding those text features? In those texts that I'm reading that have complexity. So you can see I don't need to make this its own lesson. My lesson can be about the context clues. Here's another example. Solve problems using proportions and ratios. Proportions and ratios really only show up in the 7th grade in middle school. They show up again in high school, but the only place they show up in middle school is in 7th grade. So I really want to invest some time there. It's pretty critical. They need it for the future, and this is their chance to get it. This right here, explain the difference between a population and a sample, is something so small, so easy, that my math friends actually said, this could be a short little lesson that I just fold into doing this standard, and it doesn't need to be its own thing. Perfect. I just picked a standard to focus on. So you get the idea. What I'm doing here is I'm kind of looking at the standards, I'm weighting them out, I'm thinking about what can we just going to naturally do, and I don't have to call it out as a special lesson, and then what are the things I really want to spend my time on? And I'm going to pick the things to spend my time on. Once I have that standard, I have to think about its taxonomy level. A taxonomy is really just a vocabulary. It is a way of talking about and thinking about the level of understanding that students have to demonstrate. You may have heard of Bloom's taxonomy or Webb's depth of knowledge. These are also taxonomies. My district, GIPS, uses Marzano's taxonomy when talking about the level of knowledge needed in a standard. And it doesn't matter what taxonomy you use, just as long as you have a consistent vocabulary for talking about it. So we're going to use Marzano. I think it's pretty simple. I'm going to lay it out for you. The bottom level is retrieval. Retrieval level tasks ask kids to recall information. It's about memorizing. This might be where I said, first he went to the store, then he met his friend, and then they went to the party. Just straight up retrieval. I'm retelling, I'm recalling what happened. Maybe I'm matching words to definitions, memorization, those kinds of things. Comprehension level tasks ask me to start representing my knowledge. So I might explain what happened. I might look at a graph and explain what it is that it tells the reader. I might take my vocabulary words and I might demonstrate my comprehension by writing a sentence that included that vocabulary word. I might draw a picture that represents that vocabulary word. So these are things that demonstrate my comprehension, my understanding, right? At the analysis level, I'm really starting to think about how do things go together? How can I classify groups? How can I create categories for my knowledge? How can I look at something and think about what's the best way to do something? So I'll give you an example out of math. When students are presented with a story problem, they often have to use analysis to figure out what kind of a problem is this? What is it asking me to do? And what strategy should I use to solve this problem? That requires analysis. The actual computation of the algorithm is probably down here at the retrieval level, right? Maybe I'm just plugging it into a formula. But when I'm thinking about which algorithm should I use, how do I approach this task, that's analysis level thinking. At the very top of the taxonomy, we have knowledge utilization. Knowledge utilization is where I'm creating something new. So I'm really looking at, here's all of the things that I know. And now I'm going to write my research essay about that. Or I'm going to compose an original essay that explains whatever. I have read 2 different articles, and now I'm going to persuade you about which author's opinion is better, right? So I'm using my knowledge that I've gathered in other places, and I am creating something new. That's knowledge utilization. We don't see that a whole lot in our standards in Nebraska other than in science. In science, there's a ton of knowledge utilization standards. In the other areas, not as much. So I'm going to give you a quick example of what this might look like going all the way through. So I'm going to take a simile, right? So simile, her eyes were like diamonds. There you go, right? So retrieval level task would just be, I can tell you that a simile uses like or as. A retrieval level task would be, I can circle the similes in my essay. Comprehension would be, I can tell you what that simile means. I can explain to you what is being compared. I can find those things and then explain. Yeah, I can explain what they mean, right? So I almost went to analysis there. So analysis would be, not only can I find it and explain what it means, but I can explain why the author included that simile. What was it they were trying to say? What was it that they were trying to communicate? What did it add to the story? That's analysis level thinking. Knowledge utilization thinking is, I'm going to create my own simile that communicates my feelings about nature. That's knowledge utilization. So you can see how it gets more and more and more complex, and it asks for greater and greater and greater levels of understanding from our students. So that's the taxonomy. Why does the taxonomy matter? The taxonomy matters because if the standard is asking for kids to write their own similes and incorporate them into writing, and all we have kids doing is say, similes used like or as. This is a simile. They are never going to get to this level. The taxonomy of the standard matters because for so many of our students, they're stuck in comprehension and retrieval the vast majority of their time, and they're never getting up to analysis. And so they're never getting to truly the level that the standard is asking them to obtain. So how do we figure out the taxonomy of the standard? We look at the verbs, and then we look at the knowledge that we have to have, right? So in this particular example, this is a second grade language arts example. Identify and explain why authors use literary devices. So my verbs are identify, which is a retrieval level verb, right? Identify, that's a simile. And explain. So if I was just explaining the simile, that would be comprehension. But the fact of the matter is that I have to explain why an author uses the literary device, and that makes it analysis. In our resources folder, I have a copy of the taxonomy and some examples of verbs that fall into each of those levels. When you look at your standard, you can look at the verbs that are in that standard and then compare it to the verbs on the taxonomy table. And that will help you to figure out what it is that it's asking your kids to do. It's a really critical step because, like I said, if all I have kids do is say, this is an onomatopoeia, but never explain why authors use onomatopoeia, I'm sunk. Here's the problem, though. This is a huge standard, and there's no way that my kids can do all of that in a single day. And so the other thing I have to do with my standard is after I know it, I know what the taxonomy level is, I have to turn it into clear learning targets for my students. Clear learning targets. So how do I do that? Because I can't give them this whole thing on a single day. I might want to have them just identify onomatopoeias. And then the next day have them explain an onomatopoeia. And maybe on the third day, we explain why we have onomatopoeias. Here's some helpful hints. Learning targets should be written in student-friendly language. I don't want to just throw up all of these words onto the screen at the same time for my students. I'm just going to confuse them. I want to describe their learning and not their activities. So we'll see an example of this in a moment. We don't want to put things like, I can complete a graphic organizer. I can circle the similes. I can complete number 42 on page 53, right? And although we want it in student-friendly language, we have to be really careful that we're not dumbing it down. We still need to use appropriate academic vocabulary. We're not going to use words like mathy. We're going to say mathematical. We're not going to say find. We're going to say locate. Having these rich academic words in our targets helps kids to know those academic words and to use them. So let's try it. We have this standard right here, 8th grade, language arts. Analyze and explain the relationships between elements of literary text. And here are the elements that they're supposed to know in the 8th grade. Character development, setting, plot, conflict, point of view, inferred, and recurring themes. That's huge. There's 2 verbs there, analyze and explain. What is it that I'm analyzing and explaining? Relationships between elements. Well, then that means I have to pick more than one of these. However, as an 8th grader, I can't throw up all of this on the screen. They would just get lost. So I'm going to give you an example and a non-example. Here's a non-example. I can complete the plot diagram graphic organizer. It's a task, not learning. And the plot diagram doesn't mean that I can explain the relationships between the things on the diagram, and doesn't mean that I've done any analyzing. It's something I'm going to do that day, but it doesn't necessarily tell me what it is that I'm learning. Here's a better example. I can analyze, you see we took the verb right from the standard, how the character's actions, there's character, affect how the plot progresses. Plot. So I am analyzing how characters affect the plot. I have a relationship between elements, and I'm analyzing it. This is an appropriate target for students, and 8th graders can understand this. I can't just throw that target up on the board, though, and hope the kids notice it or hope that they maybe pick up on it. I need to invest just a little bit of time, not very much, in getting them ready to talk about the target. I'm going to designate about 5 minutes to get them ready to use it. And during that time, I might define that academic vocabulary. So I'm going to make sure that they know what analyze means. We might need to do a quick refresher on plot, because although they're 8th graders, sometimes they forget. I might have students brainstorm ways in which they're going to demonstrate the target. So maybe I'll say, okay, today, you're going to be able to analyze how characters affect the plot. What are some tools that maybe we've used in class or some ways that you could do this? Talk in your group and make a plan for how you might analyze and how you might organize your analyzing. Oops, there we go. The teacher might show an example of student work, and then the students discuss how that work meets the target. So I might put up a paragraph where a student has analyzed a character, but maybe they analyze the character's feelings and not their actions. Or maybe they forgot to talk about the plot and they just talked about the character and described the character. Well, by putting up this sample of work and having kids say, ooh, it meets these parts of the target, but not those parts of the target, it lets kids get really crystal clear about what it is that they are doing that day and what their outcomes are supposed to be. And because they know what they're supposed to be learning, again, they're so much more likely to actually learn it. So how do you tell kids what the target is? Lots of ways that I've seen in class. Some I've taken pictures of, some I found on the internet. I've seen lots of teachers post it in a slideshow presentation, put it in pocket charts, slide it into sleeves on the wall. The kids know where to look every single day. That's also important. I've seen it written actually on the worksheet or the paper that is at their station for the day or at their table. I've also seen times where students have to copy down the target and they keep those in a notebook for class. I've seen teachers share targets on calendars in Google Classroom. I used to give my students a sheet at the beginning of every unit, and on that sheet it had, this is what we're going to learn, this is how we're going to learn it, and this is how we're going to demonstrate that we've learned it. All of that was laid out at the beginning of every unit, so my students knew where we were in our progress. You could even put up a poster like this with each lesson and then the target for the day. And they know that way where they are in their progression, how much farther it is to go before they get to the place where they need to end up. It doesn't really matter where you put the target or how you communicate it to the students. What matters is that you do communicate it to the students, that you do help them to know what it is that they're supposed to be learning, and that they can access that target at any time. If someone walked into your room and they asked your students, what are you learning today? Would they say math? Or would they say, we're learning how to use ratios to solve story problems? Oh, well, how do you know if you're doing it right? Well, can they explain it? Can they tell you what they're learning and why they're learning it and what they're supposed to demonstrate at the end? If they can, they have clarity and they can meet that target. You have clarity and you've communicated it to your students. So all of this gets us to a place, though, where what we're really trying to get to is when teachers are clear about their target, they know what it is they want their students to learn, then their teaching aligns with that target. They stop doing the things that don't matter, and they start doing the things that do matter. They make sure that the tasks that students are doing in class get the kids to achieve the target. And they make sure that the talk that the students are doing among themselves and in teams also help them to achieve that target. John Hattie, who does meta-analysis research on education. In other words, he takes lots and lots of research studies, puts them together, and says, what's the most effective in education? For John Hattie, clarity, teacher clarity about what is being taught and why is one of the most important factors in whether or not a student learns and retains what they learn. So, for your assignment for this module, the very first thing you have to do is a very, very small step. You need to pick one target, or excuse me, one standard, just one standard that you're going to teach for any grade level for your subject area. You're going to turn that target into I keep saying target. Standard. You're going to pick one standard. You're going to turn that standard into 2 targets, right? And you're going to post the standard, the taxonomy, and the 2 targets on your discussion board. Then we're going to give feedback to each other. This is not easy at first. It takes practice. And the way that we get better at writing targets is to help each other. So again, just for clarity, because I kind of mixed up my language there, you're going to pick one standard, say what that standard is. You're going to tell us the taxonomy level of that standard. Take your best guess. It's okay to be wrong. And it's okay to be mostly right. It's a little bit interpretive. And then you're going to write 2 targets, right? Standard, taxonomy, 2 targets. That's your assignment. Simple, easy peasy. If you have questions, please, please, please post them.